So, welcome to the first part of the series. We are covering books I think that should be read in Southeast Michigan. I went to high school at Orchard Lake St. Mary's. I attended college at Grand Valley State University for 1 year. I was a criminal justice undergrad. I attended Wayne State University for several years. English major, secondary education. I did not graduate, and to be honest, I wasn't the best student. I did enjoy the classes I took and the books I read. They may have these books on the itinerary now. They may not. I don't know how they cover the topic these days. But I've never read this book, so I'm going to read it to you. I hope you enjoy. This is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. Rashid, Khalidi, author of Palestinian Identity. This is a New York Times bestseller, rigorous and lucid, a lapidary narrative. Intellectual heir to Edward Said, has written one of the great books of the Israeli-Palestinian question. That was David Gardner, Financial Times. Not familiar with the Financial Times. This is my first time reading a book out loud and on camera. Hopefully I can read many. I have many on the way, and I have many in my cart right now to read. $700 worth, actually, of books. So please, come with me on this journey. I am going to get right in. And if the volume quality needs to be improved, please let me know and I will improve it. I will get a lavalier, a better setup, I suppose. Doing my best. Introduction. For a few years during the early 1990s, I lived in Jerusalem for several months at a time, doing research in the private libraries of some of the city's oldest families, including my own. With my wife and children, I stayed in an apartment belonging to the Khalidi family, waqf, or religious endowment, in the heart of the cramped, noisy old city. From the roof of this building, there was a view of two of the greatest masterpieces of early Islamic architecture. The shining golden dome of the rock was just over 300 feet away on the Haram al-Sharif. Beyond it lay the smaller, silver-gray cupola of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, with the Mount of Olives in the background. In other directions, one could see the old city's churches and synagogues. Just down Bab al-Sicilia Street was the main building of the Gaddafi Library, which was founded in 1899 by my grandfather, Haj Rashid al-Khalidi, with a bequest from his mother, Khadija al-Khalidi. The library houses more than 1,200 manuscripts, mainly in Arabic, some in Persian and Ottoman Turkish, the oldest dating back to the earliest 11th century, including some 2000 19th century Arabic books and miscellaneous family papers. The collection is one of the most extensive in all of Palestine that is still in the hands of its original owners. Note that Arabic means been transcribed according to the simplified Imez system, except where other spelling was preferred by the individuals themselves. Okay, that was just a note. At the time of my stay, the main library structure, which dates from around the 13th century, was undergoing restoration. So the contents were being stored temporarily in large cardboard boxes in the Mamluk era building, connected to our apartment by a narrow stairway. I spent over a year among those boxes, going through dusty, worm-eaten books, documents, and letters belonging to generations of the Khalidis. Among them, my great-great-great uncle, Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi. Through his papers, I discovered a worldly man with a broad education acquired in Jerusalem, Malta, Istanbul, and Vienna. A man who is deeply interested in comparative religion, especially in Judaism, and who owned a number of books in European languages on this and other subjects. Yusuf Dia was heir to a long line of Jerusalemite Islamic scholars and legal functionaries. His father, Al-Sayyid Muhammad Ali al-Khalidi, had served for some 50 years as deputy Qadi and chief of the Jerusalem Sharia Court Secretariat. But at a young age, Yusuf Dia sought a different path for himself. After absorbing the fundamentals of a traditional Islamic education, he left Palestine at the age of 18, without his father's approval, we are told, to spend 2 years at a British Church Missionary Society school in Malta. From there, he went to study at the Imperial Medical School in Istanbul, after which he attended the city's Robert College, recently founded by American Protestant missionaries. For 5 years during the 1860s, Yusuf Dia attended some of the first institutions in the region that provided a modern Western-style education, learning English, French, German, and much else. It was an unusual trajectory for a young man from a family of Muslim religious scholars in the mid-19th century. Having obtained this broad training, Yusuf Dia filled various roles as an Ottoman government official, translator in the foreign ministry, consul in the Russian port of Poti on the Black Sea, governor of districts in Kurdistan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, and mayor of Jerusalem for nearly a decade, with stints teaching at the Royal Imperial University in Vienna. He was also elected as the deputy from Jerusalem to the short-lived Ottoman parliament established in 1876 under the empire's new constitution, earning Sultan Abd al-Hamid's enmity because he supported parliamentary prerogatives over executive power. In line with the family tradition and his Islamic and Western education, al-Khalidi became an accomplished scholar as well. The Khalidi library contains many books, of his in French, German, and English, as well as his correspondence with learned figures in Europe and the Middle East. Additionally, old Austrian, French, and British newspapers in the library show that Yusuf Dia regularly read the overseas press. There is evidence that he receives these material via the Austrian post office in Istanbul, which was not subject to the draconian Ottoman laws of censorship. As a result of wide reading, as well as his time in Vienna and other European countries, and from his encounters with Christian missionaries, Yusuf Dia was fully conscious of the pervasiveness of Western anti-Semitism. He had also gained impressive knowledge of the intellectual origins of Zionism, specifically its nature as a response to Christian Europe's virulent anti-Semitism. He was unfoundly familiar with Der Judastat by the Viennese journalist Theodor Herzl, published in 1896, and was aware of the first two Zionist congresses in Basel, Switzerland in 1897 and 1898. Indeed, it seems clear that Yusuf Dia knew of Herzl from his own time in Vienna. He knew of the debates and of the views of the different Zionist leaders and tendencies, including Herzl's explicit call for a state for the Jews, with the sovereign right to control immigration. Moreover, as mayor of Jerusalem, he had witnessed the friction with the local population prompted by the first years of proto-Zionist activity, starting with the arrival of the earliest European Jewish settlers in the late 1870s and early 1880s. Herzl, the acknowledged leader of the growing movement he had founded, had paid his sole visit to Palestine in 1898, time he took coincided with the German Kaiser William II. He had already begun to give thought to some of the issues involved in the colonization of Palestine, writing in his diary in 1895. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. Sorry about the furnace, guys. It's a little chilly here in Detroit. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in transit countries, while denying it employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Yusuf Dia would have been more aware than most of his compatriots in Palestine of the ambition of the nascent Zionist movement, as well as its strengths, resources, and appeal. He knew perfectly well that there was no way to reconcile Zionism's claims on Palestine and its explicit aim of Jewish statehood and sovereignty there with the rights and well-being of the country's indigenous inhabitants. It is for these reasons, presumably, that on March 1st, 1899, Yusuf Dia sent a prescient 7-page letter to the French chief rabbi, Zadok Khan, with the intention that it be passed on to the founder of modern Zionism. The letter began with an expression of Yusuf Dia's admiration for Herzl, whom he esteemed as a man, as a writer of talent, and as a true Jewish patriot, and of his respect for Judaism and for Jews, who he said were our cousins, referring to the patriarch Abraham, revered as their common forefather by both Jews and Muslims. He understood the motivations for Zionism, just as he deplored the persecution to which Jews were subject in Europe. In light of this, he wrote, Zionism in principle was natural, beautiful, and just. And who could contest the rights of Jews in Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country. The sentence is sometimes cited in isolation from the rest of the letter to represent Yusuf Dia's enthusiastic acceptance of the entire Zionist program in Palestine. However, the former mayor and deputy of Jerusalem went on to warn of the dangers he foresaw as a consequence of the implementation of the Zionist project for a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine. The Zionist idea would sow dissension among Christians, Muslims, and Jews there. It would imperil the status and security that Jews had enjoyed throughout the Ottoman domains. Coming to his main purpose, Yusuf Dia said soberly that whatever the merits of Zionism, the brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account. The important of them were that Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others. Palestine had an indigenous population that would never accept being superseded. Yusuf Dia spoke with full knowledge of the facts, asserting that it was pure folly for Zionism to plan to take over Palestine. Nothing could be more just and equitable than for the unhappy Jewish nation to find a refugee elsewhere, but he concluded with a heartfelt plea, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. Herzl's reply to Yusuf Dia came quickly on March 19th. His letter was probably the first response by a founder of the Zionist movement to a cognate Palestinian objection to its embryonic plans for Palestine. In it, Herzl established that was to become a pattern of dismissing and insignificant the interests and sometimes the very existence of the indigenous population. The Zionist leader simply ignored the letter's basic thesis that Palestine was already inhabited by a population that would not agree to be supplanted. Although Herzl had visited the country once, he, like many early European Zionists, had not much knowledge of or contact with its native inhabitants. He also failed to address Khalid's well-founded concerns about the danger the Zionist program would pose to the large, well-established Jewish communities all over the Middle East. Glossing over the fact that Zionism was ultimately meant to lead Jewish dominance of Palestine, Herzl employed a justification that has been a touchstone for colonists at all times and in all places, and that would become a staple argument of the Zionist movement. Jewish immigration would benefit the indigenous people of Palestine. It is their well-being, their individual wealth, which we will increase by bringing in our own. Echoing the language he had used in Der Judestaat, Herzl added, in allowing immigration to a number of Jews bring their intelligence, their financial acumen, and their means of enterprise to the country, no one can doubt that the well-being of the entire country would be the happy result. Most revealingly, the letter addresses a consideration that Yusuf Dia had not raised. You see another difficulty, excellency, in this existence of the non-Jewish Palestine or population in Palestine. But who would think of sending them away? With his assurance in response to Al-Khalidi's unasked question, Herzl alludes to the desire recording in his diary to spirit the country's poor population discreetly across the borders. It is clear from this chilling quotation that Herzl grasped the importance of disappearing the native population of Palestine in order for Zionism to succeed. Moreover, the 1901 character that he co-drafted for the Jewish Ottoman Land Company includes the same principle of the removal of inhabitants of Palestine to other provinces and territories of the Ottoman Empire. Although Herzl stressed in his writings that his project was based on the highest tolerance with full rights for all, what was meant was no more than toleration of any minorities that might remain after the rest had been moved elsewhere. Herzl underestimated his correspondent. From Al-Khalidi's letter, From Al-Khalidi's letter, it is clear that he understood perfectly well that at issue was not the immigration of a limited number of Jews to Palestine, but rather the transformation of the entire land into a Jewish state. Given Herzl's reply to him, Yusuf Dia could only have come to one of two conclusions. Either the Zionist leader meant to deceive him by concealing the true aims of the Zionist movement, or Herzl simply did not see Yusuf Dia and the Arabs of Palestine as worthy of being taken seriously. Instead, with the smug self-assurance so common to 19th century Europeans, Herzl offered the preposterous inducement that the colonization and ultimately the usurpation of their land by strangers would benefit the people of that country. Herzl's thinking in his reply to Yusuf Dia appeared to have been based on the assumption that the Arabs could ultimately be bribed or fooled into ignoring what the Zionist movement actually intended for Palestine. This condescending attitude toward that intelligence, not to speak of the rights of the Arab population in Palestine, was to be serially repeated by Zionist, British, European, and American leaders in the decades that followed, down to the present day. As for the Jewish state that was ultimately created by the movement Herzl founded, as Yusuf Dia foresaw, there was to be room there for only one people, the Jewish people. Others would indeed be spirited away or at best tolerated. Yusuf Dia's letter and Herzl's response to it are well known to his historians. Let me pause there. There's a break. Yusuf Dia's letter and Herzl's response to it are well known to historians of the period, but most of them do not seem to have reflected carefully on what was perhaps the first meaningful exchange between a leading Palestinian figure and a founder of the Zionist movement. They have not reckoned fully with Herzl's rationalizations, which laid out quite plainly the essentially colonial nature of the century-long conflict in Palestine. Nor have they acknowledged al-Khalidi's arguments, which have been borne out in full since 1899. Starting after World War I, the dismantling of the indigenous Palestinian society was set in motion by the large-scale immigration of European Jewish settlers supported by the newly established British Mandate authorities, who helped them build the autonomous structure of a Zionist parastate. Additionally, a separate Jewish-controlled sector of the economy was created through the exclusion of Arab labor from Jewish-owned firms under the slogan Avoda Ivrit, Hebrew labor, and the injection of truly massive amounts of capital from abroad. By the middle of the 1930s, although Jews were still a minority of the population, this largely autonomous sector was bigger than the Arab-owned part of the economy. The indigenous population was further diminished by the crushing repression of the great 1936-1939 Arab revolt against British rule, during which 14 to 17% of the adult male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled, as the British employed 100,000 troops and air power to master Palestinian resistance. Meanwhile, a massive wave of Jewish immigration as a result of persecution by the Nazi regime in Germany raised the Jewish population in Palestine from just 18% of the total in 1932 to over 31% in 1939. This provided the demographic critical mass and military manpower that was necessary for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. The expulsion then of over half the Arab population of the country, first by Zionist militias and then by the Israeli army, completed the military and political triumph of Zionism. Such radical social engineering at the expense of the indigenous population is the way of all colonial settler movements. In Palestine, it was a necessary precondition for transforming most of an overwhelmingly Arab country into a predominantly Jewish state. As this book will argue, the modern history of Palestine can be understood in these terms as a colonial war waged against the indigenous population by a variety of parties to force them to relinquish their homeland to another people against their will. Although this war shares many of the typical characteristics of other colonial campaigns, it also possesses very specific characteristics, as it was fought by and on behalf of the Zionist movement, which itself was and is a very particular colonial project. Further complicating this understanding is the fact that this colonial conflict, conducted with massive support from external powers, became over time a national confrontation between two national entities, two peoples. Underlying this feature and amplifying it was the profound resonance for Jews and also for many Christians of the biblical connection to the historic land of Israel. Expertly woven into modern political Zionism, this resonance has become integral to it. A late 19th century colonial national movement thus adorned itself with a biblical coat that was powerfully attractive to Bible-reading Protestants in Great Britain and the United States, blinding them to the modernity of Zionism and to its colonial nature. For how could Jews be colonizing the land where their religion began? Given this blindness, the conflict is portrayed as, at best, a slight forward, if tragic, national clash between two peoples with rights in the same land. At worst, it is described as the result of the fanatical invertebrate hatred of Arabs and Muslims for the Jewish people as they assert their inalienable right to their eternal, God-given homeland. In fact, there is no reason that what has happened in Palestine for over a century cannot be understood as both a colonial and national conflict. But our concern here is its colonial nature, as this aspect has been as underappreciated as it is central, even though those qualities typically of other colonial campaigns are everywhere in evidence in the modern history of Palestine. Characteristically, European colonizers seeking to dominate indigenous peoples, whether in the Americas, Africa, Asia, or Australasia, or in Ireland, was in parentheses, have always described them in pejorative terms. They also always claim that they will leave the native population better off as a result of their rule. The civilizing and progressive nature of their colonial projects serves to justify whatever enormities are perpetrated against the indigenous people to fulfill their objectives. One need only refer to the rhetoric of French administrators in North Africa or of British viceroys in India. Of the British Raj, Lord Curzon said, "To feel that somewhere among these millions you have left a little justice or happiness or prosperity, a sense of manliness or moral dignity, a spring of patriotism, a dawn of intellectual enlightenment, or a stirring of duty, were it not be before exist. That is enough. That is the Englishman's justification in India." The words, "where it did not before exist," bear repeating. For Curzon and others of his colonial class, the natives did not know what was best for them and could not achieve these things on their own. "You cannot do without us," Curzon said in another speech. For over a century, the Palestinians have been depicted in precisely the same language by their colonizers as have been other indigenous peoples. The condescending rhetoric of Theodore Herzl and other Zionist leaders was no different from that of the European peers. The Jewish state, Herzl wrote, would form a part of a wall of defense for Europe and Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. This was similar to the language used in the conquest of the Native American frontier, which ended in the 19th century, which was the eradication or subjugation of the continent's entire native population. As in North America, the colonization of Palestine, like that of South Africa, Australia, Algeria, and parts of East Africa, was meant to yield a white European settler colony. The same tone toward the Palestinians that characterizes both Curzon's rhetoric and Herzl's letter is replicated in much discourse on Palestine in the United States, Europe, and Israel even today. In line with this colonial rationale, there is a vast body of literature dedicated to proving that before the advent of European Zionist colonization, Palestine was barren, empty, and backward. Historical Palestine has been the subject of innumerable disparaging tropes in Western popular culture, as well as academically worthless writing that purports to be scientific and scholarly, but that is riddled with historical errors, misrepresentations, and sometimes outright bigotry. At most, this literature asserts the country was inhabited by a small population of rootless and nomadic Bedouin, I think it's French, it's capitalized, who had no fixed identity and no attachment to the land that they were passing through, essentially as transients. The corollary of this contention is that it was only the labor and drive of the new Jewish immigrants that turned the country into the blooming garden it supposedly is today, and that only they had an identification with and love for the land, as well as a God-given right to it. This attitude is summed up in the slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land," used by Christian supporters of a Jewish Palestine, as well as early Zionists like Israel Zangwill. Palestine was terra nullius to those who came to settle it, with those living there nameless and amorphous. Thus, Herzl's letter to Yusuf Dia referred to Palestinian Arabs, then roughly 95% of the country's inhabitants, as its non-Jewish population. Essentially, the point being made is that the Palestinians did not exist, or were of no account, or did not deserve to inhabit the country they so sadly neglected. If they did not exist, then even well-founded Palestinian objections to the Zionist movement's plans could simply be ignored. Just as Herzl dismissed Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi's letter, most later schemes for the disposition of Palestine were similarly cavalier. The 1917 Balfour Declaration, issued by a British cabinet and committing Britain to the creation of a national Jewish homeland, never mentioned the Palestinians, the great majority of the country's population at the time, even as it set the course for Palestine for the subsequent century. The idea that the Palestinians simply do not exist, or even worse, are the malicious invention of those who wish Israel ill, is supported by such fraudulent books as Joan Peters' From Time Immemorial, now universally considered by scholars to be completely without merit. On publication in 1984, however, it received a rapturous reception, and it is still in print and selling discouragingly well. Such literature, both pseudo-scholarly and popular, is largely based on European travelers' accounts, on those of new Zionist immigrants, or on British mandatory sources. It is often produced by people who know nothing about the indigenous society and its history and have disdain for it, or who, worse, yet have an agenda that depends on its invisibility or disappearance. Rarely utilizing sources produced from within Palestinian society, these representations essentially repeat the perspective, the ignorance, and the biases tinged by European arrogance of outsiders. The message is also amply represented in popular culture in Israel and the United States, as well as in political and public life. It has been amplified via mass market books such as Leon Ursi's novel Exodus and the Academy Award-winning movie that it spawned, works that have had a vast impact on an entire generation that serve to confirm and deepen pre-existing prejudices. Political figures have explicitly denied the existence of Palestinians. For example, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. I think that we've had an invented Palestinian people who are in fact Arabs. That was a quote. While returning from a trip to Palestine in March 2015, the governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, said, quote, "There's really no such thing as the Palestinians," unquote. To some degree, every U.S. administration since Harry Truman's has been staffed by people making policy on Palestine whose views indicate that they believe Palestinians, whether or not they exist, are lesser beings than Israelis. Significantly, Many early apostles of Zionism had been proud to embrace the colonial nature of their project. The imminent revisionist Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky, let me try that again. Jabotinsky, godfather of the political trend that has dominated Israel since 1977, upheld by Prime Ministers Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, and Benjamin Netanyahu, was especially clear about this. Jabotinsky wrote in 1923, "Every native population in the world resists colonialists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonialized." That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope. They will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Such honesty was rare among other leading Zionists who, like Herzl, protested the innocent purity of their aims and deceived their Western listeners, and perhaps themselves, with fairy tales about the benign intentions toward the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. Jabotinsky and his followers were among the few who were frank enough to admit publicly and bluntly the harsh realities inevitably attendant on the implantation of a colonial settler society with an existing population. Specifically, he acknowledged that the constant threat of the use of massive force against the Arab majority would be necessary to implement the Zionist program. What he called an iron wall of bayonets was an imperative for its success. As Jabotinsky put it, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. This was still the high age of colonialism, when such things being done to native societies by Westerners were normalized and described as progress. The social and economic institutions founded by the early Zionists, which were central to the success of the Zionist project, were also unquestionably understood by all and described as colonial. The most important of these institutions was the Jewish Colonization Association, in 1924 renamed the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. This body was originally established by the German Jewish philanthropist Baron Maurice de Hirsch, and later combined with a similar organization founded by the British peer and financier Lord Edmund de Rothschild. The JCA provided the massive financial support that made possible extensive land purchases and the subsidiaries that enabled most of the early Zionist colonies in Palestine to survive and thrive before and during the Mandate period. Unremarkably, once colonialism took on a bad odor in the post-World War II era of decolonization, the colonial origins and practice of Zionism in Israel were whitewashed and conveniently forgotten in Israel and the West. In fact, Zionism, for 2 decades, the coddled stepchild of British colonialism, rebranded itself as an anti-colonial movement. The occasion for this drastic makeover was a campaign of sabotage and terrorism launched against Great Britain after it drastically limited its support of Jewish immigration with the 1939 White Paper on the eve of World War II. This falling out between erstwhile allies to help them fight the Palestinians in the late 1930s, Britain had armed and trained the Jewish settlers it allowed to enter their country, encouraged the outlandish idea that the Zionist movement was itself anti-colonial. There was no escaping the fact that Zionism initially had clung tightly to the British Empire for support, and had only successfully implanted itself in Palestine thanks to the unceasing efforts of British imperialism. It could not otherwise, for as Jabotinsky stressed, only the British had the means to wage the colonial war that was necessary to suppress Palestinian resistance to take over their country. This war has continued since then, waged sometimes overtly and sometimes covertly, but invariably with the tacit or overt approval and often direct involvement of the leading powers of the day and the sanction of the international bodies they dominated, the League of Nations and the United Nations. Today, the conflict that was engendered by this classic 19th century European colonial venture in a non-European land, supported from 1917 onward by the greatest Western imperial power of its age, is rarely described in such unvarnished terms. Indeed, those who analyze not only Israeli settlement efforts in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, but the entire Zionist enterprise from the perspective of its colonial settler origins and nature, are often vilified. Many cannot accept the contradiction inherently in the idea that although Zionism undoubtedly succeeded in creating a thriving national entity in Israel, its roots are a colonial settler project, as are those of other modern countries. The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Nor can they accept that it would not have succeeded but for the support of the great imperial powers, Britain, and later the United States. Zionism, therefore, could be and was both a national and colonial settler movement at one and the same time. Rather than write a comprehensive survey of Palestinian history, I've chosen to focus on 6 turning points in the struggle over Palestine. These 6 events, from the 1917 issuance of the Balfour Declaration, which decided the fate of Palestine, to Israel's siege of the Gaza Strip, and its intermittent wars on Gaza's population in the early 2000s, highlight the colonial nature of the Hundred Years' War on Palestine, and also the indispensable role of external powers in waging it. I've told this story partly through the experiences of Palestinians who have lived through the war, many of them members of my family who were present at some of the episodes described. I've included my own recollections of events that I've witnessed, as well as materials belonging to my own and other families, in a variety of first-person narratives. My purpose throughout has been to show that this conflict must be seen quite differently from most of prevailing views of it. I have written several books and numerous articles on different aspects of Palestinian history in a purely academic vein. The underpinning of this book, too, is research-based and academic, but it also has a first-person dimension that is usually excluded from scholarly history. Although members of my family have been involved in events in Palestine for years, as have I, as a witness or a participant, our experiences are not unique, in spite of the advantages we enjoyed because of our class and status. One could draw on many such accounts, although much history from below and from other sectors of Palestinian society remains to be related. Nevertheless, in spite of the tensions inherent in this chosen approach, I believe it helps illuminate a perspective that is missing from the way in which the story of Palestine has been told in most of the literature. I should add that this book does not correspond to a lachrymose conception of the past 100 years of Palestinian history, to reprise the great historian Salo Baron's brilliant critique of a 19th century trend in Jewish historical writing. Palestinians have been accused by those who sympathize with their oppressors of wallowing in their own victimization. It is a fact, however, that like all indigenous peoples confronting colonial wars, the Palestinians faced odds that were daunting and sometimes impossible. It is also true that they have suffered repeated defeats and have often been divided and badly led. None of this means that Palestinians could not sometimes defy those odds successfully, or that at other times they could not have made better choices. But we cannot overlook the formidable international imperial forces arrayed against them, the scale of which has often been dismissed, and in spite of which they have displayed remarkable resilience. It is my hope that this book will reflect this resilience and help recover some of what has thus far been airbrushed out of the history by those who control all of historic Palestine and the narrative surrounding it. That was the introduction. British Mandate Palestine Partition Plan, 1947, Arab State, Jewish State, Jerusalem, Corpus Separatum. So this book is in color. This map is not. This is not video enhanced. I don't know why this map is not in color. Maybe because none of the pages are in color. Big bummer. As an educated person, this map is illegible. I cannot tell the difference of the shades. The first declaration of war, 1917-1939. There are plenty of cases of war being begun before it is declared. Arthur James Balfour. At the turn of the 20th century, before Zionist colonization had much appreciated effect on Palestine, new ideas were spreading, modern educational literacy had begun to expand, and the integration of the country's economy into the global capitalist order was proceeding apace. Production for export of crops like wheat and citrus fruit, capital investment in agriculture, and the introduction of cash crops and wage labor, notable in the rapid spread of orange groves, were changing the face of large sections of the countryside. This evolution went hand in hand with the accumulation of private land ownership by fewer people. Large tracts were coming under the control of absentee landlords, many of whom lived in Beirut or Damascus at the expense of peasant smallholders. Sanitation, health, and rates of live births were all slowly improving. Death rates were in decline, and the population was in consequence increasing more quickly. The telegraph, the steamship, the railway, gaslight, electricity, and modern roads were gradually transforming cities, towns, and even some rural villages. At the same time, travel within the region and beyond was faster, cheaper, and safer and more convenient. In the 1860s, Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi had to go all the way to Malta and Istanbul to acquire an education along Western lines. By 1914, such an education could be had in a variety of state, private, and missionary schools and colleges in Palestine, Beirut, Cairo, and Damascus. Modern pedagogy was often introduced by foreign missionary schools, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, as well as by the Jewish schools of the Alliance Israelite Universale. Partly out of fear that foreign missionaries in leagues with their great power patrons would come to dominate the instruction of the younger generation, the Ottoman authorities established a growing network of state schools, which eventually served more students in Palestine than did foreign schools. Although universal access to education and widespread literacy were still far in the future, the changes leading up to World War I offered new horizons and novel ideas to more and more people. The Arab population benefited from these developments. Socially, Palestine was still heavily rural, with a predominantly patriarchal, hierarchical nature, as it largely remained until 1948. It was dominated by narrow urban elites drawn from a few families, like my own, who clung to their positions and privileges even as they adapted to new conditions, with younger family members acquiring modern educations and learning foreign languages to maintain their standing and their advantages. These elites controlled the politics of Palestine, although the growth of new professions, trades, and classes meant that in the 1900s there were more avenues of advancement and upward mobility in the rapidly growing coastal cities of Jaffa and Haifa in particular. Change was more visible than in more conservative inland towns such as Jerusalem, Nablus, and Hebron, as well as the former witnessed the appearance of a nascent commercial bourgeoisie and an embryonic urban working class. At the same time, the sense of identity of large parts of the population was also evolving and shifting. My grandfather's generation would have been identified in terms of family, religious affiliation, and city or village of origin. They would have cherished their descent from revered ancestors. They would have been proud speakers of Arabic, the language of the Quran, and heirs to Arab culture. They might have felt loyalty to the Ottoman dynasty and state, an allegiance rooted in custom, as well as sense of the Ottoman state as a bulwark defending the lands of the earliest and greatest Muslim empires, lands coveted by Christendom since the Crusades, lands in which the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem were located. That loyalty had begun to weaken in the 19th century, however, as the religious foundation of the state was diminished, as Ottoman military defeats and territorial losses mounted, and as the ideas of nationalism evolved and spread. Greater mobility and access to education accelerated these shifts, and the burgeoning press and availability of printed books also played an important role. 32 new newspapers and periodicals were established in Palestine between 1908 and 1914, with even more in the 1920s and 1930s. Different forms of identification, such as nationhood and novel ideas about social organization, including working class solidarity and the role of women in society, were emerging to challenge previously fixed affiliations. These modes of belonging, whether to a national or class of professional group, were still in formation and informed overlapping ties of loyalty. Yusuf Diaz's 1899 letter to Herzl, for example, evokes religious affiliation, Ottoman loyalty, local pride in Jerusalem, and a clear sense of identification with Palestine. In the first decade of the 20th century, a large proportion of the Jews living in Palestine were still culturally quite similar to and lived reasonably comfortably alongside city-dwelling Muslims and Christians. They were mostly ultra-Orthodox and non-Zionist Mizrahi Eastern or Sephardic descendants of Jews expelled from Spain, Urbanites of Middle Eastern or Mediterranean origin who often spoke Arabic or Turkish, even if only as a second or third language. In spite of marked religious distinctions between them and their neighbors, they were not foreigners, nor were they Europeans or settlers. They saw themselves, and were seen as Jews who were part of the indigenous Muslim majority society. Moreover, some young European Ashkenazi Jews who settled in Palestine at this time, including such ardent Zionists as David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, one became prime minister and the other the president of Israel, initially sought a measure of integration into the local society. Ben-Gurion and Ben-Zvi even took Ottoman nationality, studied in Istanbul, and learned Arabic and Turkish. The much more rapid pace of transformation in the advanced countries of Western Europe and North America compared to the rest of the world during the modern industrial era led many outside observers, including some eminent scholars, to mistakenly claim that Middle Eastern societies, including Palestine, were stagnant and unchanging, or even in decline. In decline was in quotes. We now know, We now know from many indices that this was by no means the case. A growing body of solidly grounded historical work based on Ottoman, Palestinian, Israeli, and Western sources completely refutes these false notions. However, recent scholarship on Palestine in the years before 1948 goes much further than just dealing with misconceptions and distortions at the heart of such thinking. Whatever it may have looked like to uninformed outsiders, it is clear that by the first part of the 20th century, there existed in Palestine, under Ottoman rule, a vibrant Arab society undergoing a series of rapid and accelerating transitions, much like several other Middle Eastern societies around it. Major external shocks have powerful effects on societies, especially on their sense of self. The Ottoman Empire grew increasingly fragile in the early 20th century, with major territorial losses in the Balkans, Libya, and elsewhere. A long series of wrenching wars and upheavals stretching for nearly a decade started with the Libyan War in 1911 through 1912, followed by the Balkan Wars, 1912 through 1913, and then the extraordinary dislocations of World War I, which led to the empire's disappearance. The 4 years of that war brought severe shortages, penury, starvation, disease, the requisitioning of draft animals, and the conscription of most working-age men who were sent to the front. Greater Syria, which included Palestine and present-day Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, is estimated to have suffered 500,000 deaths between 1915 and 1918 due to famine alone, which was exacerbated by a plague of locusts. Hunger and general hardship were only one cause of the dire state of the population. Focused as most observers were on the appalling casualties of the Western Front, few realized that the Ottoman Empire overall was dealt the heaviest wartime losses of any major combatant power, with over 3 million dead, 15% of the total population. Most of these casualties were civilians, the largest single group being the victims of massacres at the behest of the Ottoman authorities in 1915 and 1916. Armenians, Assyrians, and other Christians. Additionally, Of the 2.8 million Ottoman soldiers originally mobilized, as many as 750,000 may have died during the war. Arab casualties were correspondingly high, since the army units recruited in Iraq and Greater Syria were heavily represented on bloody battlegrounds such as Ottoman Eastern Front against Russia, as well as in Gallipoli, Sinai, Palestine, and Iraq. The demographer Justin McCarthy estimated that after growing by about 1% annually until 1914, Palestine's population declined by 6% during the war. The turmoil of the period did not spare even well-off families, such as my own. When my father, Ishmael, was born in 1915, four of his adult brothers, Numan, Hassan, Hussein, and Ahmad, had been conscripted for service in the Ottoman army. Two of them sustained wounds in the fighting, but all were fortunate to survive. My aunt, Anbara Salam al-Khalidi, remembering harrowing images of starvation and deprivation in the streets of Beirut, where she lived as a young woman. Hussein al-Khalidi, my uncle, who served as a medical officer during the war, recalled similar heartbreaking scenes in Jerusalem, where he saw the bodies of dozens of people who had starved to death lying in the streets. The wartime extractions of the Ottoman authorities included the hanging on charges of treason of my aunt's fiancé, Abd al-Ghalini al-Urasisi, alongside many other Arab nationalist patriots. In 1917, my grandfather, Haj Rashid al-Khalidi, and my grandmother, Amira, known to all as Hassan, together with the other residents of the Haifa area, received an evacuation order from the Ottoman authorities. To escape the encroaching dangers of war, they left their homes at Tel al-Arish near Haifa. My grandfather's work as a judge had brought them there from Jerusalem many years earlier, with their four youngest children, my father among them. For several months, the family sought refuge in the hill village of Der Ghassane, east of Haifa, with members of the Haburiti clan, Bar Huti clan, with whom they had long-standing connections. The village was far enough from the sea to be out of the range of the Allied naval guns and away from the heavy fighting along the coast of the British armies under General Sir Edmund Allenby advanced northward. From the spring of 1917 through the late fall, the southern parts of the country were the scene of a grinding series of battles between British and Ottoman forces, the latter backed by German and Austrian troops. The fighting involved trench warfare, air raids, and intensive land and naval artillery bombardments. British and Imperial units launched a number of major offensives, which slowly pushed back the Ottoman defenders. The fighting spread to the north of Palestine in the winter. Jerusalem, in the center, was captured by the British in December 1917 and continued into early 1918. In many regions, the direct impact of the war caused intense suffering. One of the worst hit districts comprised Gaza City and the nearby towns and villages, where large areas were pulverized by heavy British shelling during prolonged trench warfare and then the slow Allied advance up the Mediterranean coastline. Soon after Haifa fell to the British in November 1917, my grandfather's family returned to their Tal al-Rish home. Another aunt, Fatima al-Khalidi Salam, then an 8-year-old, recalled her father addressing the British troops. "Welcome, welcome," he said in an undoubtedly imperfect English. Hassan, who heard this as Ya Waklam, woe to you, in Arabic, feared that he had endangered the family by taunting the alien soldiers. Whether Haj Rahib al-Khalidi welcomed or lamented the arrival of the British, 2 of his sons were still fighting on the other side, and 2 were being held as POWs, which placed the family in a perilous position. 2 uncles remained with the Ottoman army, which resisted the British in northern Palestine and Syria until late 1918. They were among the thousands of men still absent from their homes at war's end. Some had emigrated to the Americas to escape conscription, while many, the writer Arif Shahidid, later known as Arif al-Arif, among them, were being held in Allied prisoner of war camps. Others were in the hills, dodging the draft, like Najib Nasser, editor of the outspokenly anti-Zionist newspaper Al-Kermil. Meanwhile, there were Arab soldiers who had deserted the Ottoman army and crossed the lines, or who were serving in the forces of the Arab revolt led by Sharif Hussein and allied with Britain. Still others, such as Isa al-Isa, the editor of Philistine, who had been exiled by the Ottoman authorities for his fierce independence with its strong echoes of Arab nationalism, were forced from the relatively cosmopolitan confines to Haifa to various small towns in the heart of rural Anatolia. All these profound material shocks heightened the impact of the wrenching post-war political changes, which obliged people to rethink long-standing senses of identity. By the end of fighting, people in Palestine and in much of the Arab world found themselves under occupation by European armies. After 400 years, they were confronted by the disconcerting prospect of alien rule and the swift disappearance of Ottoman control, which had been the only system of government known for over 20 generations. It was in the midst of this great trauma, as one era ended and another began, against a grim background of suffering, loss, and deprivation, that Palestinians learned, in a fragmentary fashion, of the Balfour Declaration. The momentous statement made just over a century ago on behalf of Britain's cabinet on November 2nd, 1917, by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Arthur James Balfour, what he has come to be known as the Balfour Declaration, comprised the single sentence: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It will clearly understood. I gotta do this again. Sorry, guys. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. End quote. If before World War I, many prescient Palestinians had begun to regard the Zionist movement as a threat, the Balfour Declaration introduced a new, fearsome element. In the soft, deceptive language of diplomacy, with its ambiguous phrase approving the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, the declaration effectively pledged Britain's support for Theodore Herzl's aims of Jewish statehood, sovereignty, and control of immigration in the whole of Palestine. Significantly, the overwhelming Arab majority of the population, around 94% at that time, went unmentioned by Balfour, except in a backhanded way as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. They were described in terms of what they were not, and certainly not as a nation or a people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the 67 words of the Declaration. This overwhelming majority of the population was promised only civil and religious rights, not political or national rights. By way of contrast, Balfour ascribed national rights to what he called the Jewish people, who in 1917 were a tiny minority, 6% of the country's inhabitants. Before securing British backing, the Zionist movement had been a colonizing project in search of a great power patron. Having failed to find a sponsor in the Ottoman Empire, the Wilhelmine Germany, and elsewhere, Theodor Herzl's successor, Chaim Weizmann, and his colleagues finally met with success in their approach to the wartime British cabinet led by David Lloyd George, acquiring the support of the greatest power of the age. The Palestinians now faced a far more formidable adversary than ever before, with British troops at that very moment advancing northward and occupying their country, troops who served a government that had pledged to implant a national home wherein unlimited immigration was meant to produce a future Jewish minority. The Palestinians now faced a far more formidable adversary than before, with British troops at that very moment advancing northward and occupying their country, troops who served a government that had pledged to implant a national home wherein unlimited immigration was meant to produce a future Jewish majority. The British government's intentions and objectives at that time have been amply analyzed over the past century. Among its many motivations were both a romantic, religiously deprived, philo-Semitic desire to return the Hebrews to the land of the Bible, and an anti-Semitic wish to reduce immigration to Britain, linked to a conviction that world Jewry had the power to keep newly revolutionary Russia fighting in the war and bring the United States into it. Beyond those impulses, Britain primarily desired control over Palestine for geopolitical, strategic reasons that antedated World War I and that had only been reinforced by wartime events. However important that other motivations may have been, this was the central one. The British Empire was never motivated by altruism. Britain's strategic interests were perfectly served by its sponsorship of the Zionist project, just as they were served by a range of regional wartime undertakings. Among them were commitments made in 1915 and 1916, promising independence to the Arabs led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, enshrined in the Hussein McMahon McMahon correspondence, and a secret 1916 deal with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the two powers agreed to a colonial partition of the Eastern Arab countries. More important than British motivations for issuing the Balfour Declaration is what this undertaking meant in practice for the crystal clear aims of the Zionist movement: sovereignty and complete control of Palestine. With Britain's unstinting support, these aims suddenly became plausible. Some leading British politicians extending back to Zionism that went well beyond the carefully phrased text of the Declaration. At a dinner at Balfour's home in 1922, three of the most prominent British statesmen of the era, Lloyd George, Balfour, and Secretary of State for the Colonies Winston Churchill, assured Wiseman that by the term Jewish national home, they always meant an eventual Jewish state. Lloyd George convinced the Zionist leader that for this reason, Britain would never allow representative government in Palestine, nor did it. For Zionists, their enterprise was now backed by an indispensable iron wall of British military might, in the words of Zeb Jabotinsky. For the inhabitants of Palestine, whose future ultimately decided, Balfour's careful, calibrated prose was in effect a gun pointed directly at their heads, a declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population. The majority now faced the prospect of being outnumbered by unlimited Jewish immigration to a country then almost completely Arab in its population and culture. Whether intended this way or not, the Declaration launched a full-blown colonial conflict, a century-long assault on the Palestinian people aimed at fostering an exclusivist national home at their expense. The Palestinian reaction to the Balfour Declaration was late in coming and initially was relatively muted. Word of the British pronouncement had spread in most of other parts of the world immediately following its promulgation. In Palestine, however, local newspapers had been shuttered since the beginning of the war by both government censorship and a lack of newsprint, the result of a tight Allied naval blockade of Ottoman ports. After British troops occupied Jerusalem in December 1917, the military regime banned publication of news of declaration. Indeed, the British authorities did not allow newspapers to appear in Palestine for nearly 2 years. When reports of the Balfour Declaration finally reached Palestine, they tricked in slowly via word of mouth and then through copies of Egyptian newspapers that travelers brought from Cairo. The bombshell struck a society prostrate and exhausted at this late stage of the war, when survivors of the chaos and displacement were slowly returning to their homes. There was evidence that they reacted with shock to the news. In December 1918, 33 exiled Palestinians, included Al Isa, who had just made their way from Anatolia to Damascus, where their access to news was not restricted, sent an advance letter of protest to the peace conference being convened in Versailles and to the British Foreign Office. They stressed that this country is our country and expressed the horror at the Zionist claim that Palestine would be turned into a national home for them. Such prospects may have seemed remote to many Palestinians when the Balfour Declaration was issued, at a time when Jews constituted a tiny majority of the population. Nonetheless, some far-sighted individuals, Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi among them, had discerned the danger posed by Zionism early on. In 1914, Isa al-Isa wrote in an astute editorial in Palestine of a nation threatened with disappearance by the Zionist tide in this Palestinian land. A nation which is threatened in its very being with expulsion from its homeland. Those who felt trepidation about the encroachment of the Zionist movement were alarmed by its ability to purchase large tracts of fertile land from which the indigenous peasants were moved, and by its success in increasing Jewish immigration. Indeed, between 1909 and 1914, some 40,000 Jewish immigrants had arrived, although some left soon afterwards. And 18 new colonies of a 1914 total of 52 had been created by the Zionist movement on land it had bought mainly from absentee landlords. The relatively recent concentration of private land ownership greatly facilitated these land purchases. The impact of Palestinians was especially pronounced in agricultural communities in areas of intensive Zionist colonization. The coastal plain and the fertile Marj ibn Amr and Hula valleys in the north. Many peasants in villages neighboring the new colonies have been deprived of their lands as a result of the land sales. Some had also suffered in armed encounters with their first paramilitary units formed by the European Jewish settlers. Their trepidation was shared by Arab city dwellers in Haifa, and Jerusalem, the main centers of Jewish populations then and now, who observed with mounting concern the stream of Jewish immigrants in the years before the war. After the issuance of the Balfour Declaration, the disastrous implications for the future of Palestine were increasingly apparent to all. Beyond demographic and other shifts, World War I and its aftermath accelerated the change in Palestinian national sentiment from a love of country and loyalties to family and locale to a thoroughly modern form of nationalism. In a world where nationalism had been gained ground for many decades, the Great War provided a global boost to the idea. The tendency was compounded toward the end of the war by Woodrow Wilson in the United States and Vladimir Lenin in Soviet Russia, who both espoused the principle of national self-determinism, albeit in different ways and with different aims. Whatever the intentions of those two leaders, the apparent endorsement of the national aspirations of peoples the world over by ostensibly anti-colonial powers had an enormous impact. Clearly, Wilson, who had no intention of applying the principle to most of those who took them as inspiration for their hopes of national liberation. Indeed, he confessed that he was bewildered by the plethora of peoples, most of whom he had never heard, who responded to his call for self-determination. Nevertheless, the hopes aroused and then disappointed by Wilson's pronouncements in support of national self-determination. By the Bolshevik Revolution and by the indifference of the Allies at the Versailles Peace Conference to the demands of colonialized people for independence, sparked massive revolutionary anti-colonial upheavals in India, Egypt, China, Korea, Ireland, and elsewhere. The dissolution of the Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman empires, transnational dynastic states, was also in large measure a function of the spread of nationalism and its intensification during and after the war. Political identities in Palestine had certainly evolved prior to the war. In keeping with global shifts and the evolution of the Ottoman state. However, this had happened relatively slowly within the constraints of the dynastic, transnational, and religiously legitimated empire. The mental map of most of its subjects before 1914 was limited by their having been governed by this political system for so long that it was hard for them to conceive of not living under Ottoman rule. Going into the post-war world, suffering from collective trauma, the people of Palestine faced a radically new reality. They were to be ruled by Britain, and their country had been promised to others as a national home. Against this could be set their expectations about the possibility of Arab independence and self-determination promised to Sharif Hussein by the British in 1916, a compromise repeated in multiple public pledges thereafter, including in an Anglo-French declaration of 1918, before being enshrined in the Covenant of the New League of Nations in 1919. One crucial window into Palestinians' perceptions of themselves and their understanding of events between the wars is the Palestinian press. Two newspapers, Isa al-Isa's Haifa publication, Philistine, and Al-Carmel, published in Haifa by Nahib Nasser, were bastions of local patriotism, and critics of the Zionist British Entente and the danger that it posed to the Arab majority in Palestine. They were among the most influential beacons of the idea of Palestinian identity. Other newspapers echoed and amplified the same themes, focusing on the burgeoning, largely closely Jewish economy and other institutions created by Zionist state-building project and support by the British authorities. After attending the ceremonial opening of a new rail line in 1929 that connected Tel Aviv to the Jewish settlements and Arab villages to the south, Isa al-Isa wrote an ominous editorial in Philistine. All along the route, he wrote, Jewish settlers took advantage of the presence of British officials to make new demands of them, while Palestinians were nowhere to be seen. There was only one tarbush, he said, among so many hats. The message was clear. The Watanin, the people of the country, were poorly organized, while Al-Qawm, this nation, exploited every opportunity offered them. The title of the editorial summed up by the gravity of al-Iqsa's warnings, strangers in our own land, our drowsiness, and their alertness. Another such window is provided by the growing number of published memoirs by Palestinians. Most of them are in Arabic and reflect the concerns of their upper-class and middle-class authors. To find the views of the less well-to-do segments of Palestinian society is more difficult. There is little oral history available from the early decades of British rule. While sources such as these provide a sense of the evolution of identity among Palestinians with the increasing use of the terms Palestine, and Palestinians, the turning points in this process are hard to pinpoint. A few things can be gleaned from my grandfather's personal trajectory. Hajj Rashid, who had a traditional religious education and who served as a religious official as a Qadi, was a close friend of Isa al-Isa, who incidentally was my wife Mona's grandfather, and contributed articles on topics like education, libraries, and culture to Palestine. Through Khalidi and al-Isa family lore, we get a sense of the frequent social interactions between the two, one Muslim, the other Greek Orthodox, primarily in the garden of my grandfather's house in Tal al-Rish, on the outskirts of Haifa. In one story, the two men put up the interminable visit of a boring, conservative, local sheikh before returning, after he leaves, to the more convivial pleasure of private drinking. The point is that Hajj Rahib, a religious figure who was part of leading secular advocates of Palestine as a source of identity, was a part of a circle leading secular advocates. Okay. The history revealed by even a cursory examination of the press, memoirs, and similar sources generated by Palestinians flies in the face of the popular mythology of the conflict, which is premised on their non-existence, or lack of a collective consciousness. In fact, Palestinian identity and nationalism are all too often seen to be no more than recent expressions of an unreasoning, if not fanatical, opposition to Jewish national self-determination. But Palestinian identity, much like Zionism, emerged in response to many stimuli, and almost exactly the same time as did modern political Zionism. The threat of Zionism was only one of these stimuli, just as anti-Semitism was only one of these factors fueling Zionism. As newspapers like Philistine and Al-Khmir reveal, this identity included love of country, a desire to improve society, religious attachment to Palestine, an opposition to European control. After the war, the focus of Palestine as a central locus of identity drew strength from widespread frustration at the blocking of Arab aspirations in Syria and elsewhere, as the Middle East became suffocatingly dominated by the European colonial powers. This identity is thus comparable to the other Arab nation-state identities that emerged around the same time in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Indeed, all the neighboring Arab peoples developed modern national identities very similar to that of the Palestinians, and did so without the impact of the emergence of Zionist colonialism in their midst. Just like Zionism, Palestinian, and other Arab national identities were modern and contingent, a product of late 19th and 20th century circumstances, not eternal and immutable. The denial of an authentic, independent Palestinian identity is a piece with Herzl's colonialist views on the alleged benefits of Zionism to the indigenous population, and constitutes a crucial element in the erasure of the national rights and peoplehood by the Balfour Declaration and its sequels. Thanks for being here, guys. As soon as they were able to do, that was not in the book, that was me. As soon as they were able to do so in the wake of World War I, Palestinians began to organize politically in opposition both to British rule and to the imposition of the Zionist movement as a privileged interlocutor of the British. Palestinians' efforts included petitions to the British, to the Paris Peace Conference, and to the newly formed League of Nations. Their most notable effort was a series of 7 Palestine Arab congresses planned by a countrywide network of Muslim Christian societies and held from 1919 until 1928. These congresses put forward a consistent series of demands focused on independence for Arab Palestine, rejection of the Balfour Declaration, support for majority rule, and ending unlimited Jewish immigration and land purchases. The congresses established an Arab executive that met repeatedly with British officials in Jerusalem and London, albeit to little avail. It was a dialogue of the deaf. British refused to recognize the representative authority of the congresses or its leaders and insisted on Arab acceptance of the Balfour Declaration and the terms of the mandate that had succeeded it. The antithesis of every substantive Arab demand as a precondition for discussion. It's a weird sentence. The British refused to recognize the representative authority of the congresses or its leaders, and insisted on Arab acceptance of the Balfour Declaration and the terms of the mandate that had succeeded it, the antithesis of every substantive Arab demand, as a precondition for discussion. The Palestinian leadership pursued this fruitless legalistic approach for over a decade and a half. In contrast to these elite-led initiatives, popular dissatisfaction with British support for Zionist aspirations exploded into demonstrations, strikes, and riots, with violence flaring notably in 1920, 1921, 1929, each episode more intense than the previous one. In every case, these were spontaneous eruptions, often provoked by Zionist groups flexing their muscle. The British repressed peaceful protests and outbreaks of violence with equally harsh severity, but Arab popular discontent discontinued. By the early 1930s, younger, educated, lower, middle, and middle-class elements, impatient with the conciliatory approach of the elite, began to launch more radical initiatives and organize more militant groups. These included an activist network set up throughout the northern parts of the country by Haifa-based itinerant preacher of Syrian origin named Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam, which was clandestinely preparing for an armed uprising, as well as the Istiqlal Independence Party, whose names summarized its aims. All of these efforts took place initially in the shadow of a strict British military regime that lasted until 1920. One of the congresses was held in Damascus because the British had planned Palestinian political activity. All these efforts took place initially in the shadow of a strict British military regime that lasted until 1920. One of the congresses was held in Damascus because the British had banned Palestinian political activity. And thereafter, under a series of British mandatory high commissioners. The first of them was Sir Herbert Samuel, a committed Zionist and former cabinet minister who laid the governmental foundations for much of which followed, and who ably advanced Zionist aims while foiling those of the Palestinians. Well-informed Palestinians were aware of what the Zionists were preaching, both abroad and in Hebrew in Palestine, to their followers. That unlimited immigration would produce a Jewish majority that would permit a takeover of the country. They had been following the doings and sayings of Zionist leaders via the extensive reportage on the subject in the Arabic press since well before the war. While Chaim Weizmann had, for example, told several prominent Arabs at a dinner party in Jerusalem in March 1918 to beware treacherous insinuations that Zionists were seeking political power, most knew that assertions were strategic and meant to cloak the Zionists' real objectives. Indeed, the Zionist movement's leaders understood that under no circumstances should they talk as though the Zionist program required the expulsion of the Arabs, because that would cause the Jews to lose the world's sympathy. But knowledgeable Palestinians were not deceived. While readers of the press, members of the elite, and villagers and city dwellers who were in direct contact with the Jewish settlers were conscious of the threat, such awareness was far from universal. Similarly, the evolution of the Palestinian sense of self was uneven. While most people desired Palestinian independence, some entertained the hope that such independence could be secured as part of a larger Arab state. A newspaper briefly published in Jerusalem in 1919 by Arif al-Arif and another political figure, Muhammad Hassan al-Budari, proclaimed this aspiration in its name, Syria al-Janubi, or Southern Syria. The publication was quickly suppressed by the British. A government under Amir Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein, had been established in Damascus in 1918, and many Palestinians hoped their country would become the southern part of this nation state. However, France claimed Syria for itself on the basis of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and in July 1920, French troops occupied the country, eliminating the newborn Arab state. As Arab countries under mandates or other forms of direct or indirect European control became preoccupied with their own narrow problems, more and more Palestinians realized that they would have to depend on themselves. Arabism and a sense of belonging to the larger Arab world always remained strong, but Palestinian identity was constantly reinforced by Britain's bias in favor of the burgeoning Zionist project. I mean, you guys don't care if I'm center, do you? I'm reading a book. That was not in the book. Changes elsewhere in the Middle East swept a region racked by continued instability, following a bitter clash with Allied occupying forces. The nucleus of a Turkish republic arose in Anatolia in place of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Britain failed to impose a one-sided treaty on Iran and withdrew its occupation forces in 1921. France established itself in Syria and Lebanon after crushing Amir Faisal's state. Egyptians revolting against their British overlords in 1919 were suppressed with great difficulty by the colonial power, which was finally obliged to grant Egypt a never seen this word before. Simulacrum of independence in 1922. Something analogous occurred in Iraq, where a widespread armed uprising in 1920 obliged the British to grant self-ruler under an Arab monarchy headed by the same Emir Faisal, now with the title of king. Within a little more than a decade after World War I, Turks, Iranians, Syrians, Egyptians, and Iraqis all achieved a measure of independence, albeit often highly constrained and severely limited. In Palestine, the British operated with a different set of rules. In 1922, the new League of Nations issued its mandate for Palestine, which formalized Britain's governance of the country. In an extraordinary gift to the Zionist movement, the mandate not only incorporated the text of the Balfour Declaration verbatim, it substantially amplified the Declaration's commitments. The document begins with a reference to Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which states that for certain communities, their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized. It continues by giving an international pledge to uphold the provisions of the Balfour Declaration. The clear implication of this sequence is that only one people in Palestine is to be recognized with national rights: the Jewish people. This was in contradistinction to every other Middle Eastern mandated territory, where Article 22 of the Covenant applied to the entire population and was ultimately meant to allow for some form of independence of these countries. In the third paragraph of the mandate's preamble, the Jewish people, and only the Jewish people, are described as having a historic connection to Palestine. In the eyes of the drafters, the entire 2,000-year-old built environment of the country, with its villages, shrines, castles, mosques, churches, and monuments dating to the Ottoman, Mameluke, Ayyubid, Crusader, Abbasid, Umayyad, Byzantine, and earlier periods, belonged to no people at all, or only to amorphous religious groups. There were people there, certainly, but they had no history or collective existence and could therefore be ignored. The roots of what the Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling called the politicide of the Palestinian people are on full display in the mandate's preamble. The surest way to eradicate a people's right to their land is to deny their historical connection to it. Nowhere in the subsequent 28 articles of the mandate is there any reference to the Palestinians as a people with national or political rights. Indeed, as in the Balfour Declaration, the words Arab and Palestinian do not appear. The only protections envisaged for the great majority of Palestinians' populations involved personal and religious rights and preservation of the status quo at sacred sites. On the other hand, the mandate laid out the key means for establishing and expanding the national home for the Jewish people, which, according to its drafters, the Zionist movement was not creating but reconstituting. 7 of the mandate's 28 articles are devoted to the privileges and facilities to be extended to the Zionist movement to implement the national home policy, and the others deal with administrative and diplomatic matters, and the longest article treats the question of antiquities. The Zionist movement, in its embodiment in Palestine as the Jewish Agency, was explicitly designated as the official representative of the country's Jewish population. Although before the mass immigration of committed European Zionists, the Jewish community comprised mainly either religious or Mizrahi Jews who in the main were not Zionist or even opposed Zionism. Of course, no such official representative was designated for the unnamed Arab majority. Article 2 of the mandate provided for self-governing institutions. However, the context makes clear that this applied only to the Yishuv, as the Jewish population of Palestine was called, while the Palestinian majority was consistently denied access to such institutions. Any later concessions offered on matters of representation, such as a British proposal for an Arab agency, were conditional on equal representation for the tiny minority and the large majority, and on Palestinian acceptance of the terms of the mandate, which explicitly nullified their existence. Only the first catch-22 in which Palestinians would find themselves trapped. Representative institutions for the entire country or a democratic basis, representative institutions for the entire country on a democratic basis and with real power were never an offer. In keeping with Lloyd George's private assurance to Eisman, for the Palestinian majority, would naturally have voted to end the privileged position of the Zionist movement in their country. One of the key provisions of the mandate was Article 4, which gave the Jewish agency quasi-governmental status as a public body with wide-ranging powers in economic and social spheres, and the ability to assist and take part in the development of the country as a whole. Beyond making the Jewish agency a partner to the mandatory government, this provision allowed it to acquire international diplomatic status and thereby formally represent Zionist interests before the League of Nations and elsewhere. Such representation was normally an attribute of sovereignty, and the Zionist movement took great advantage of it to bolster its international standing and act as a parastate. Again, no such powers were allowed to the Palestinian majority over the entire 30 years of the mandate, in spite of repeated demands. Article 6 enjoyed the mandatory power to facilitate Jewish immigration and encourage close settlement by Jews on the land. A most crucial provision, given the importance of demography and control of land throughout the subsequent century of struggle between Zionism and Palestinians, this provision was the foundation for significant growth in Jewish population, an acquisition of strategically located lands that allowed for control of the country's territorial background along the coast, in eastern Galilee, and in the great fertile Marj ibn Amr valley connecting them. Here we go, 2 hours. Approaching 2 hours. Article 7 provided for a nationality law to facilitate the acquisition of Palestinian citizenship by Jews. The same law was used to deny nationality to Palestinians who had immigrated to the Americas during the Ottoman era and now desired to return to their homeland. Thus, Jewish immigrants, irrespective of their origins, could acquire Palestinian nationality, while native Palestinian Arabs who happened to be abroad when the British took over were denied it. Finally, other articles allowed the Jewish agency to take over or establish public works, allowed each community to maintain schools in its own language, which meant Jewish agency control over much of the Yeshuv's school system, and made Hebrew an official language of the country. In sum, the mandate essentially allowed for the creation of a Zionist administration parallel to that of the British mandatory government, which was tasked with fostering and supporting it. This parallel body was meant to exercise for one part of the population many of the functionings of a sovereign state, including democratic representation and control of education, health, public works, and international diplomacy. To enjoy all the attributes of sovereignty, this entity lacked only military force. That would come in time. To fully appreciate the particularly destructive forces of the mandate for Palestinians, it is worth returning to Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations and looking at a confidential memo written by Lord Balfour in September 1919 for areas formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. Article 22 provisionally recognized their existence as independent nations. The background to this article in relation to the Middle East involved repeated British promises of independence to all the Arabs of the Ottoman domains during World War I in return for their support against the Ottomans, as well as the self-determination proclaimed by Woodrow Wilson. Indeed, all the other mandated territories in the Middle East ultimately won independence, although both mandatory powers, Britain and France, twisted the rules to maintain the maximum degree of control for the longest possible time. Only the Palestinians were denied these advantages, while representative institutions and progress towards self-rule were obtained by the Jewish population in Palestine, which benefited uniquely from Article 22 of the Covenant. For decades, British officials disingenuously but steadfastly maintained that Palestine had been excluded from wartime promises of Arab independence. However, when relevant extracts from the Hussein McMahon correspondence were revealed for the first time in 1938, the British government was forced to admit that the language used was at the very least ambiguous. Only the Palestinians were denied these advantages, while representative institutions and progress towards self-rule were obtained by the Jewish population in Palestine, which benefited uniquely from Article 22 of the Covenant. For decades, British officials disingenuously but steadfastly maintained that Palestine had been excluded from wartime promises of Arab independence. However, when relevant extracts from the Hussein McMahon correspondence were revealed for the first time in 1938, the British government was forced to admit the language was at the very least ambiguous. Okay, I just reread that whole paragraph. I must be exhausted. 2 hours in, I'm going to have to pause. Page 37, halfway through. Thank you for coming. We'll get back to this tomorrow.